Good morning, friends. It was feathers of this sort that Krylenko kept plucking from the dead rooster, that the SRs had not taken measures to stop individual terrorist acts by their unemployed and languishing gunmen, that was the whole of their terrorism. Yes, and those gunmen of theirs didn't do anything either. In 1922, two of them, Konopleva and Semyonov, with suspicious eagerness, enriched the GPU and the tribunal with their voluntary evidence. But their evidence couldn't be pinned on the SR Central Committee, and suddenly and inexplicably, these inveterate terrorists were released scot-free. All the evidence was such that it had to be bolstered up with props. Krylenko explained things this way in regard to one of the witnesses. If this person had really wanted to make things up, it is unlikely he would have done so in such a way as to hit the target merely by accident. Strongly put indeed, this could be said about any piece of fabricated testimony whatever. Or else about Donskoy. Could one really suspect him of possessing the special insight to testify to what the prosecution wanted? It was just the other way around for Konopleva. The reliability of her testimony was evidenced by the fact that she had not testified to everything the prosecution wanted, but enough for the defendants to be shot. If we ask whether Konopleva concocted all this, then it is clear. If one is going to concoct, one must really concoct. He should know, and if one is going to expose someone, one should really expose him. But she, you see, did not carry it through to the end. Then things are put still another way. After all, it is unlikely that Yefimov needed to put Konopleva in danger of execution without cause. Once more correct, once more strongly put. Or even more strongly, could this encounter have taken place? Such a possibility is not excluded. Not excluded. That means it did take place. Off to the races. Then to the subversive group. They talked about this for a long time, and then suddenly dissolved for lack of activity. So what was all the fuss about? There had been several expropriations of money from Soviet institutions. The SRs had nothing with which to work, to rent apartments, to move from city to city. But previously, these had been the lovely, noble excess of all the revolutionists, as all the revolutionists called them. And now, in a Soviet court, they were robbery and concealment of stolen goods. Through the material adduced by the prosecution in this trial, the dull, unblinking yellow street lamps of the law throw light on the whole uncertain, wavering, deluded history of this pathetically garrulous, essentially lost, helpless, and even inactive party, which never was worthily led. And its every decision, or lack of decision, its every casting about, upsurge or retreat, was transformed into and regarded as total guilt and more guilt. And if in September 1921, 10 months before the trial, the SR Central Committee, already sitting in the Butriki, had written to the newly elected Central Committee that it did not agree to overthrow the Bolshevik dictatorship by any available means, but only through rallying the working masses and the dissemination of propaganda, all of which meant that, even as they languished in prison, they did not agree to be liberated through either terrorism or conspiracy, then that too was converted into their primary guilt. Aha! So that means that you did agree to its overthrow. And what if they were, nevertheless, not guilty of overthrowing the government, and not guilty of terrorism? And if there had been hardly any expropriations at all, and if they had long since been forgiven of all the rest? Our favorite prosecutor pulled out his canonical weapon of last resort. Ultimately, failure to denounce is a category of crime applying to all the defendants without exception, and it must be considered as having been proved. The Socialist Revolutionary Party was guilty of not having squealed on itself. Now there's something that couldn't miss. This represented a discovery that juridical thought had made in the new code. It was a paved highway along which they could keep driving and driving grateful descendants into Siberia. And Krylenko burst out in a temper. Hardened, eternal enemies. That's who the defendants are. In that case, it's quite clear, even without any trial, what has to be done with them. The code was still so new that Krylenko could not even remember the main counter-revolutionary articles by their numbers. But how he slashed about with those numbers! How profoundly he cited and interpreted them! Just as if the blade of the guillotine had for decades hinged and dropped only on those articles. And especially new and important was the fact that we did not draw the distinction between methods and means of the old Tsarist code had drawn. Such distinctions had no influence either on the classification of the charges or on the penalties imposed. For us, intent and action were identical. A resolution had been passed. We would try them for that. And whether it was carried out or not had no essential significance. Whether a man whispered to his wife in bed that it would be a good thing to overthrow the Soviet government, or whether he engaged in propaganda during elections or threw a bomb, it was all one and the same, and the punishment was identical. And just as a foresighted painter proceeds from his first few briskly drawn angular strokes to create the whole desired portrait, so for us the entire panorama of 1937, 45, and 49 becomes ever so clear and more visible in the sketches of 1922. But no, one thing is missing. What's missing is the conduct of the defendants. They have not yet become trained sheep. They are still people. They have been told little. We have been told little, very little. But from that little we can understand a great deal. Sometimes through carelessness, Krylenko cites what they said right at the trial. For example, the defendant Berg accused the Bolsheviks of responsibility for the deaths of January 5th, shooting down those who were demonstrating on behalf of the Constituent Assembly. And what Liberov said was even more direct. I admit I was guilty of failing to work hard enough at overthrowing the Bolshevik government in 1918. Yevgenia Ratner adhered to the same line, and Berg also declared, I considered myself guilty before the workers' Russia for having been unable to fight with all my strength against the so-called workers' and peasants' government. But I hope that my time has not yet gone. It has gone, darling, all gone. Of course, there is in all this an element of the ancient passion for the resounding phrase, but there is firmness too. The prosecutor argued, the accused are dangerous to Soviet Russia because they consider everything they did to have been a good thing. Perhaps certain of the defendants find their own consolation in the hope that some future chronicler will praise them or their conduct at the trial. And a decree of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee issued after the trial declared, at the trial itself they reserved to themselves the right to continue their former activity. The defendant Gendelman Grabowski, a lawyer himself, was conspicuous during the trial for his arguments with Krylenko on tampering with the testimony of witnesses and on special methods of treating witnesses before the trial. In other words, the obvious working over they had gotten from the GPU. It is all there. All the elements are there. There was only a little way to go before attaining the ideal. Apparently, the preliminary interrogation had been conducted under the supervision of the prosecutor, that same Krylenko, and during that process individual instances of a lack of consistency in testimony had been ironed out. Yet some testimony was presented for the first time only at the trial itself. Well, so what? So there were some rough spots, so it wasn't perfect. But in the last analysis, we have to declare altogether clearly and coldly that we are not concerned with the question of how the court of history is going to view our present deed. And as far as the rough spots are concerned, we will take them under advisement and correct them. But as it was, Krylenko, squirming, had to bring up, probably for the first and last time in Soviet jurisprudence, the matter of the inquiry, the initial inquiry required before investigation. And here's how cleverly he handled this point. The proceeding which took place in the absence of the prosecutor and which you considered the investigation was actually the inquiry, and the proceeding in the presence of the prosecutor which you regarded as the reinvestigation, when all the loose ends were gathered up and all the bolts tightened, was really the investigation. The disorganized materials provided by the organs for inquiry and unverified by the investigation have much less value as proof than the materials provided by the skillfully directed investigation. Clever, wasn't it? Just try grinding that up in your mortar. To be practical about it, Krylenko no doubt resented having to spend a year and a half getting ready for this trial, and another 2 months barking at the defendants, and then having to drag out his summation for 15 hours, when all these defendants had more than once been in the hands of the extraordinary organs, at times when these organs had extraordinary powers, but thanks to some circumstances or other, they had succeeded in surviving. So now Krylenko had to slave away to try to get them executed legally. There was, of course, only one possible verdict, execution for every last one of them. But Krylenko qualifies this generously. Because this case is being watched by the whole world, the prosecutor's demand does not constitute a directive to the court, which the latter would be obliged to accept immediately for consideration or decision. What a fine court, too, that requires such an explanation. And indeed, the tribunal did demonstrate its daring in the sentences it imposed. It did not hand down the death penalty for every last one of them, but for 14 only. Most of the rest got prison and camp sentences, while sentences in the form of productive labor were imposed on another 100. And just remember, reader, remember, all the other courts of the Republic watch that the Supreme Tribunal does. It provides them with guidelines. The sentences of the Werktrib are used as directives for their guidance. As to how many more would now be railroaded in the provinces, you can figure that out for yourself. And probably on appeal, the decision of the Presidium of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee was worth the whole trial. The death sentences were to remain in effect, but not to be carried out for the time being. The further fate of those condemned would depend then on the conduct of those SRs who had not yet been arrested, apparently including those abroad as well. In other words, if you move against us, we'll squash them. In the fields of Russia, they were reaping the second peacetime harvest. There was no shooting except in the courtyards of the Cheka. Pekorov in Yaroslavl, Metropolitan Veniamin in Petrograd, and always, beneath the azure sky of our first diplomats and journalists sailed abroad across the blue waters, and the Central Executive Committee of Workers' and Peasants' Deputies thrust into its pockets eternal hostages. The members of the ruling party read all 60 issues of Pravda devoted to the trial, for they all read the papers, and all of them said, yes, yes, yes. No one mumbled no. What, then, were they surprised at in 1937? What was there to complain about? Hadn't all the foundations of lawlessness been laid, first by the extrajudicial reprisals of the Cheka, and then by these early trials of this young code? The early trials and this young code. Wasn't 1937 also expedient? Expedient for Stalin's purposes, and perhaps history's too, for that matter. Prophetically, Krylenko let it slip that they were not judging the past but the future. Only the first swath cut by the scythe is difficult. On or about August 20th, 1924, Boris Viktorovich Savinkov crossed the Soviet border. He was immediately arrested and taken to the Lubyanka. In all, the interrogation lasted for just one session, and consisted solely of voluntary testimony and an evaluation of his activity. The official indictment was ready by August 23rd. The speed was totally unbelievable, but it had impact. Someone had estimated the situation quite accurately. To have forced false and pitiful testimony out of Savinkov by torture would only have wrecked the authenticity of the picture. In the official indictment, couched in already well-developed terminology that turned everything upside down, Savinkov was charged with just about everything imaginable, with being a consistent enemy of the poorest peasantry, with assisting the Russian bourgeoisie in carrying out its imperialist ambitions. In other words, he was in favor of continuing the war with Germany, with maintaining relations with representatives of the Allied command. This would have been when he was in the charge of the Ministry of War, with becoming a member of the soldiers' committees for purpose of provocation, i.e., he was elected by the soldiers' committees, and last but not least, something to make even the chickens cackle with laughter, with having had monarchist sympathies. But all that was old hat. There were some new items, too. The standard charges for all future trials: money from the imperialist, espionage for Poland. They left out Japan, believe it or not. Yes, he had also wanted to poison the Red Army with potassium cyanide. But for some reason he did not poison even one Red Army soldier. On August 26th the trial began. The presiding judge was Ulrich, this being our earliest encounter with him, and there was no prosecutor at all, or any defense lawyer. Savinkov was lackadaisical in defending himself, and he raised hardly any objection at all to the evidence. He conceived of this trial in a lyrical sense. It was his last encounter with Russia, and his last opportunity to explain himself in public, and to repent. Not of these imputed sins, but of others. And that theme song fitted well here, and greatly confused the defendant. After all, we are all Russians together. You and we add up to us. You love Russia beyond a doubt, and we respect your love. And do we not love Russia too? In fact, are we not at present the fortress and the glory of Russia? And you wanted to fight against us? Repent. But it was the sentence that was the most wonderful. Imposition of the death penalty is not required in the interest of preserving revolutionary law and order, and on the grounds that motives of vengeance should not influence the sense of justice of the proletarian masses, the death penalty was commuted to 10 years' imprisonment. Now that was a sensation, and it confused many minds, too. Did it mean relaxation, a transformation? Ulrich even published in Pravda an apologetic explanation of how Sakhanov had not been executed. You see how strong the Soviet government has become in only 7 years. Why should it be afraid of some Sakhanov or other? On the 20th anniversary of the revolution, it is going to get weaker, and don't be too hard on us, because we are going to execute thousands. And so, on the heels of the first riddle of his return, there would have been the second riddle of his being spared capital punishment, had it not been overshadowed in May 1925 by a third riddle. In the state of depression, Sakhanov jumped from an unbarred window into the interior courtyard of the Lubyanka, and the Gaipa-Yushinsky, his guardian angels, simply couldn't manage to stop him and hold on to his big, heavy body. However, just in case, so that there wouldn't be any scandal in the service, Sakhanov left them a suicide letter in which he explained logically and coherently why he was killing himself. And this letter was so authentically phrased, so clearly written in Sakhanov's style and vocabulary, that even Lev Borisovich, the son of the deceased, was fully convinced that its geniusness, and explained to everyone in Paris that no one except his father could have written it, and that he had ended his life because he realized his political bankruptcy. And all the major and most famous trials are still ahead of us. Have a good day, friends.